Right, so welcome, Luke Jordan, back to Keen on Yoga. Today, we're going to have a little chat on the philosophy and Samkhya. It's lovely to have you back, Luke. And after
Lovely
the last
to be
chat,
back, Adam.
after the last chat, I'm going to be a lot less argumentative and a lot like the. I love the comparison to a yogic Jeremy Paxman. I thought that was brilliant, and I was kind of proud of that when you mentioned that. But nevertheless, this is going to be a harmonious chat on Samkhya. Luke's passed on some notes on Samkhya. I think Luke is actually much more qualified than I. You've got an MA, I think, from SOAS.
I did a master's degree in, and the topic of my dissertation was on the relationship between Samkhya and yoga, and particularly as it relates to the notion of free will and determinism.
That sounds fantastic. Well, before we get onto that, I suppose it's fair to say that Luke is an advanced Ashtanga practitioner, so definitely a practitioner in the field as well as someone who's interested in thinking. I know that Luke's very interested in thinking because we've had many chats in India over the years, and so he combines them both really as a senior Ashtanga teacher and a very very thoughtful and deep thinker. Along those lines, the process of Samkhya is a process of experiential inquiry, you write.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. So what do you mean by that exactly? Yeah, I thought the Samkhya was very clear, kind of numerical. It means number, doesn't it? So it was a kind of numerical system to kind of categorize this is real, this is not real.
That's exactly right.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think what has to be remembered is that Samkhya and yoga traditionally. It's only really in the modern scholarship that they've been quite clearly divided as being separate from one another. And traditionally, the way the yoga school thinks of itself, if you go back to the early commentators like Vyasa or Vachaspati Misra, they see yoga as a form of Samkhya. And so if you go to the Bhagavad Gita as well, there's a section in the second chapter where Krishna says something like, "Those who see Samkhya and yoga as two separate things are idiots."
Yeah.
The wise truly sees that they are one.
Yeah, they're one thing.
So what we want to look at is Samkhya as being a form of yoga. And for me, yoga is very much a form of experiential inquiry. And
can we just back up there and say, like, division? Sorry, for people that don't know, yoga is also one of the six darshanas, right? So it's a kind of classical kind of world viewpoint within the Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism, as it were, of which Samkhya is one of them, Vedanta is one of them, yoga is one of them. To clarify,
and they're often paired together as well.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say,
pairs, and Samkhya and yoga are often paired
are
together.
One, right? So that was my question, as a preliminary question, actually, to you, and maybe for readers as well. And I'm sorry for my ignorance, but is there any difference between the actual perspective of yoga and Samkhya as philosophies, or is yoga just the active branch of Samkhya? Perhaps I should have started like that.
That's a very good question, and it really depends upon who you talk to. If you read the scholarship is quite divided between those who see Samkhya as being something very different from yoga, and those who see Samkhya and yoga being essentially the two sides of the same coin. Well, when I say it's highly divided, I would say it's probably about 70-30. Most people nowadays, in contradistinction to the tradition, believe that Samkhya is something separate from yoga. And, we could argue why that is. But I think the point to note is that it is in contradistinction to the tradition of how yoga has traditionally seen itself. So it's quite a modern development.
That all sounds highly technical. Let's rewind again. Just to try and keep this as as broadly appealing as possible, and ask you, how and what is Samkhya? I mean, I should have started with that question really.
Okay.
Look, before
Okay.
let's go back to the nuts and bolts. What
Okay.
right? I mentioned it as a numbering system. Well, obviously we have the idea of Prakriti, Purusha, and the gunas, and this is the fun.
Yes.
And Samkhya, and we've got to say that Samkhya is really the fundamental philosophy that underpins the Bhagavad Gita. I think it's fair to say that Patanjali is also a Samkhya in the Yoga Sutras.
Well,
Also a
it
Samkhya text.
underlines all of the philosophical systems of India. So in Advaita, on their level of common sense reality, they still say that the Samkhya system holds. In Tantra, it also follows the Samkhya system.
It holds, yeah. So what is it? What is it?
It's the, well, I mean, what you said at the beginning was, so yes, the word Samkhya means number, and it looks like a kind of spiritual quantity surveying, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, we've got a bit of this, we've got a bit of this, we've got a bit of this. So it outlines 25 or sometimes 26 aspects of reality, which they call the tattvas.
Yeah.
But these aspects of reality, it's not just like some kind of philosophical, logically worked out system. The way I understand it is that it's from the result of experience. And the experience of moving from gross levels of awareness to more subtle layers of awareness. So we start out and we're people in the world. And the world is composed of what they call the Mahabhutas, which is, earth, water, fire, air, ether. Right? So that's how they see the world being made up. And then, a person may or may not begin to inquire into, well, what is this world? And of course, the person themselves is made up of organs of knowledge, the seeing or the eyes and the ears and the nose, etc., and organs of action. And normally, these organs of knowledge and organs of action are orientated out into the world. And then, through a mysterious process, which we might call spiritual seeking, somebody wishes to know what this world is and what it's all about. And then begins a process of involution. What's called in the Yoga Sutras, I think it's pratitprasava, which means like a return to the origin. And in that process, what happens then is there's a meditation on these gross aspects of reality, which are seen for what they are. And then these gross aspects of reality reveal underneath them more subtle layers.
So practically speaking, how do we get from X to Y? So if Samkhya is a kind of, as you said, a kind of spiritual surveying, which it certainly seems to me that way. I mean, we're talking about...
I would say that categorizing of reality comes from experiential observation of meditation.
Right. So Samkhya doesn't really...
That is what the process is.
Talking about meditation explicitly, because as I was saying, like, you've kind of got this jnana yoga, really, is jnana yoga, the yoga of kind of knowledge, right? Separating out what is real from unreal, what is... And we haven't talked yet about, the idea that you've got basically a dualistic system, right? As I understand it, you've got Prakriti, which is matter, which is everything pretty much. And you've got God and the person, the Atman, right? Like you've got Brahman and Atman.
Well, they don't call it God in Samkhya.
Right, they don't really like God so much. So
it's not that they don't like God, but it's in the Samkhya Karika, which is only one form of Samkhya. It's not atheistic because God isn't useful to the process of awakening.
So to continue, you've got Prakriti and you've got Purusha, and what you're trying to do is essentially use your mental faculties to divide what's self and what's real, what's permanent, pure, and from what and unchanging from what is matter, which is constantly in change and a mix of aggregates and impermanent. So, as I understand it, I mean, what the Bhagavad Gita is trying to do is kind of fuse a practical experiential kind of methodology onto something which does seem quite clinical in a way, this kind of almost numerological categorization of this is, I mean, they're kind of netty, not real, I mean, how would you mentioned a kind of fleshing out of this process of meditation as well, but I don't, well, I suppose there is meditation.
Well, I think the thing to remember with it is that the tattvas, the constituents of reality that are called tattvas, are laid out as a result of experience. They are not the experiential tool themselves. They are simply what Samkhya lays out as a result of the experience that's occurred, as a result of the mystical experience that proceeds through layers of subtlety, past and beyond the sense of an individual to an overarching mystical, well, you could say oneness, but it's actually the dissolution of the individual as a separate sense of self, or as a conscious separate sense of self.
So how does one get there from this kind of rather kind of kind of thought-based kind of labeling of the world and seeing them,
So this is where I think the mistake is made. I don't think Samkhya is a thought-based system. The thoughts about what reality is comes from experiential insight, and to confuse the map that results as a result of that experiential insight is to confuse what Samkhya is. Which for me is Samkhya is a process of yoga, which is an observational, experiential contact with reality as it presents itself.
How would yoga look different in the methodology? And let's take it as practically as we can. How would yoga look different if we didn't accept the gunas and the idea of a real and unreal and a dualistic system? I mean, because you yourself have been very interested in a more kind of Advaita Vedantic kind of thought-based system. So, I mean, is there a difference for the practitioner as to whether we accept a kind of dualistic system or a system which says everything is one?
Well, it depends what kind of practitioner you're talking about, because a lot of the modern practices don't really have a tangential relationship to either Patanjali or Samkhya. If we look at the actual kind of practices that Patanjali's talking about, he's essentially talking about meditation and experiencing reality, and he follows exactly the same processes of subtilization of awareness as the Samkhya system seems to be presenting, which is, asatoma satgamaya tamasoma jyotir. We move from that which is more dense to that which is more subtle, that which is more dense to that which is more subtle. And the process of that is awareness. And like even as I was practicing this morning, I was just noticing, wow, when I did that movement, it was still a habit. It was still like a samskaric movement. And, I think most people, when they're doing whatever practices they're doing, they're still doing it in a habitual samskaric way rather than in a observational present moment awareness of what's really occurring in the here and now.
I suppose it's
what we observe in that, whether we call that guna or whether we call it anything else, is irrelevant. I think the act of present moment awareness and observation is the tool, whether it be of yoga or Samkhya, and through the implementation of that tool, we, if we're fortunate enough, get to see something more subtle underlying something that exists on a more gross level.
I actually think it's a good time then to talk about free will in as it relates to Samkhya. Well, I mean, because you're talking about refining awareness, and as if the individual has choice, but we well know that we have, the Samkhya. At a certain point, the ideas of karma and reincarnation crept in, and the individual is then bound by their own karma. And in fact, it says, and obviously in the Gita, even as you quoted before, even the wise, even the liberated, they're still bound by their own. They're still, their body and their mind is still bound by their own karma, and they go with their own karma. So, I think it's described. Another point is like puppets on a machine. That we are controlled. Yes. So how does that relate then to the possibility of actually refining awareness, or are we just stuck in a kind of trap where we're consistently controlled by our karma, one thing to the next, and kind of can't escape?
It's an absolutely fascinating question for me, and ultimately, it's a paradox, which. We're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. There's no fundamental answer to this paradox. But I just found this quote that's because I was reading my thesis in preparation to talk with you, Adam, and it's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, also about the notion of free will, and it says, and this is from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 27, and it says, "Actions in all cases are performed by the qualities of nature, the gunas. He whose mind is confused by egoism imagines, I am the doer." So this sense, I mean, this is from the Bhagavad Gita. I'm not saying that the Bhagavad Gita speaks, God's truth. I'm just, we're just talking about different philosophical positions that the different schools within the Indian tradition take.
The Gita is always a good place to start if in doubt.
Right. I mean, some people will say that whatever the Gita says is the God's truth, but then, of course, the problem with the Gita is that it will have one verse which is in direct opposition to this verse. So all of the philosophies have this: is that you can either take this side or you can take this side. You can have this argument. But the other thing that I want to say was my interest in the concept of free will and determinism, and the lens through which I read a lot of these philosophies is influenced by a guy called Ramesh Balsekar, who I met a long time ago.
I went to him as well in Mumbai. Yeah.
So things happen, deeds are done, consequences happen. There is no individual doer thereof.
But then, who can escape their own karma? Then, if there's this, I mean, that's something I was actually reading a lot about more recently. Is that you've got this kind of untouched self there, like who never changes, never does anything, and you've got all these actions, that, and you've got so how does one correlate to the other? Right? How do you get to the and is there karma for this untouched self? Obviously not. So it's all a bit confusing.
Well, I would agree with you. I would agree with you. Say, is there karma for this untouched self? When you say absolutely not, I would agree with you on that. But funny enough, a lot of the scholars would disagree with you. So Mikkel Burley, who wrote a fantastic book on Samkhya, they all have difficulties in doing it, but they're all saying that somehow this Purusha, this consciousness, has volition, and if something has volition, then it has karma. But the position of the Samkhya Karika, and as far as I understand the Bhagavad Gita, is really clear that there is no free will in Purusha. There is no karma in Purusha. Purusha, as your witnessing self, is forever untainted by the touch of Prakriti, by the touch of the gunas. And so you ask, well, how did this all come about? And the philosophical answer of Samkhya is a little bit unsatisfying. And so what they say is that Prakriti exists. Well, I mean, we can always use our mind to make a position acceptable to us. So sometimes when I've been thinking about this, I've gone, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But in this point in time, it's an unsatisfactory answer. And that is that Prakriti exists in a state of perfect equilibrium. So the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, are, you can kind of imagine it like an ocean that's perfectly still, or a lake that's perfectly still. There's not a ripple whatsoever. And somehow, mysteriously, without reason, I mean, it's a bit like the Big Bang, right? Without reason, there is a closeness that happens between Purusha and this Prakriti that's in a perfectly balanced equilibrium state. And as a result of this witnessing, Prakriti begins to move. The Rajas is stirred and it begins to move, and it has a parinama, a transformation. And I don't know if this is just me, but the way I like to think of this is there's like it's like somebody who's being watched and there's somebody who's watching. Or it's like a kind of voyeuristic thing. And the person who is being watched, let's say it's a beautiful woman who is who likes to be watched, who maybe has exhibitionist tendencies.
They're carried away here. Yeah,
this is the adult version.
Yeah, it's all getting a bit creepy. Yeah.
So, but then in this knowing that the watching is happening, there begins to be a dance, and this is the dance of Prakriti that happens with the witnessing conscious of Purusha. And so the gunas then just transform, and there is an aliveness to their movement as they transform from one thing to another.
I suppose we can very much...
According to the Samkhya Karika, there's not a consciousness, because the consciousness exists only in the witnessing consciousness, only in the Purusha. The Prakriti, the gunas, are unfolding, they're dancing according to their own inherent nature. And so it's like once they've been set off, there's a deterministic flow to the way they evolve.